The topic of our class, nonfiction prose, um, seems like a fairly obvious topic, in a way less technical, less complex to understand than fiction. Fiction, after all, is art. Nonfiction, just documenting what happens. But in fact, it's a more novel. It's a newer kind of writing than fiction. Um, the bulk of writing that's been done in history has been sacred writing, um, and nonfiction writing. The idea of that it's important to just document what happens in a for the sake of documenting reality, objective reality. I think that's a pretty new appearance historically. I think that's a legacy of the Enlightenment, the modern Enlightenment. The notion of history as a quasi-objective science, that there are objective events that are worth studying and understanding in a more or less scientific way. But it's correlated, I think, with the secularization of culture, the loss of authority and centrality of religion, which is to say, all we have left to unite us is a sense of shared participation in history, just the events that happen. It becomes less and less clear, what binds us culturally. Less and less is sacred, as they say, and more and more is categorizable as random and insignificant accident, rather than an expression of some larger cosmic plan or transcendent purpose of history. Franz Kafka writes this little parable about, I read it as about this loss of transcendent purpose. And I would like you to think about how the difference between children and adults, that difference in learning styles and forms of knowledge. This parable is, on the one hand, about the loss of royalty. I want you to think also about, what I was saying earlier about the role of royalty in popular culture. Celebrities are kind of like a replacement royalty. And this parable also, though, is about children, the difference between children and adults. And it's about the law. And media, couriers, how the communication, transfer of information. All these issues that I've been trying to bring up and address in this class in one way or another. These are all interwoven. So I find this really, really powerful little parable. Couriers. They were given the choice between becoming kings or the couriers of kings. In the manner of children, they all wanted to be couriers. As a result, there are only couriers. They gallop through the world shouting to each other messages that, since there are no kings, have become meaningless. Gladly would they put an end to their miserable existence, but they dare not because of their oaths of service. Kafka's an amazing writer. He is able to pack so much. He's very well versed in biblical writing, like Kierkegaard, who Zadie Smith draws on. So it seems, as I mentioned, to be a story about loss of the sacred, loss of enchantment, the loss of royalty, and the replacement of that by a kind of disenchanted oath of service, the law, a mechanical compulsion, imperative that we dare not betray, but that it gives no purpose or meaning, have become meaningless, and it leaves only a miserable existence. So that's clear enough. What I guess questions I'd like you to consider are this question of the manner of children. Why is it childlike to prefer to be a courier? There's a sense that I get a little bit of a accusatory tone in the parable, as if it's the children's fault. In the manner of children, as a result, it's because of their childishness that we've wound up with only couriers. They didn't see ahead that some people needed to be kings. That seems like kind of a implication of the parable. But what is childlike, we might ask, about choosing miserable obedience to the law? That seems unchildlike. That, I think, is a very dubious sentence there. In the manner of children, they all wanted to be couriers. I mean, that sentence is disguising deception. The children were deceived. They thought that in the manner of children, what actually would be childlike about the preference to be a courier? I think that it has to do with what Alison Gopnik talks about as exploration. They want to mediate, communicate, travel. They want a king to serve. It's boring to be the king, to have a royal mandate, to be a knight, to uphold a royal purpose. That seems to me like a childlike priority, why they might choose to be couriers. So that's to say that they believed in the existence of kings. I mean, to be the courier of the king presupposes that, kings are real. So there's something dubious about the way in which the narrator turns around and blames the children for the lack of kings. So if it's their fault that kings are gone. Remember, I think in the very first lecture of this course, I talked to you about this issue, and by asking, hypothetically, for you to explain yourself, explain what you're doing, explain, on a day-to-day basis, on a month-to-month, year-to-year. You can say, what are your projects? And you can make logical explanations for what you're doing, why you're in school to get a job. You can account for yourself rationally and objectively in those instrumental terms, up to a certain point. But sooner or later you run up against this question, like, what are you? Like, who are you? What are you for? What is the larger picture of your life, your story of your life, the purpose of your you. I mean, the point is that we can't really understand it. We've forgotten what this kind of royalty even means, what it feels like. Kafka's This is a parable about the modern world, running around without that transcendent sense of the sacred, that there's some bigger participation in some tradition that it is bigger than us. Now we just have us, or just our own individuality. And that's what Levi Strauss meant by hot culture. We draw these distinctions, like, dates. We keep track of how old we are, and when I was born, and that's different from when my dad was born, and like we're drawing all these distinctions, as marking out our individuality, distinguishing ourselves from everyone around us. And that's, again, I think, characteristic of our society, hugely productive and active, the investment we have in carving out and creating our individuality. And that's, I think, what Kafka's getting at. They gallop through the world shouting to each other, this kind of hyperactivity, but increasingly disenchanted. So what I think's interesting about this parable, or what I think this parable is doing in a way, is exposing a kind of adult ideology. The function of the parable is to explain why the world has lost kings, and it's blaming it on the children. I mean, and I think there's something typical about this. Adults are always complaining about the children, how they're messing things up, and have forgotten to respect the old values in some way or another. This parable is told from a perspective that's already miserable. It's trying to explain its misery. It lives in a world of nothing but misery. And what's lost is not only royalty, but childhood. So it's blaming the children in a resentful, in the resentful way, I think, of adults. In the manner of children, they chose to be couriers. There's, I think, a tone of blame there, but there's also a tone, I think, now from this perspective, I'm suggesting even jealousy. Like, we resent them because they still had faith in kings. They hadn't yet fallen into our misery. Of meaningless galloping around and shouting. So this is a long-winded introduction about the modernity and the loss of the sacred, and how that overlaps with the developmental story of adults and children that Alison Gopnik describes, and I'll be going into more detail about that. More generally, in terms of the topic of our course, non-fiction prose, the representation of reality, the concern I want you to be thinking about is what's at stake in the pretense to represent social reality objectively, who has the privilege to do so, who has the prerogative to speak and be heard, and who gets left out. So just to get you thinking about it, I want to show you some statistics regarding the unequal recognition and compensation and justice accorded to different kinds of bodies. The discrepancy between productivity and compensation since the early 70s, how that seems to be related to the development of digital technology that's made work more productive, more profitable, but those profits have not gone to the workers at the same rate that it's gone to shareholders of companies. That's just to illustrate a sort of general um, trend in disregarding the time and value of labor, the experience of bodies in general, and the workers who are, you could argue, not responsible for these increases in products in productivity. If in fact it's a matter of increases in technological efficiency, you might argue, and many people do, that well, why shouldn't it go to the shareholders, investors in the company who paid for that development of new technology? But this is, I think, a very suspicious and dangerous kind of argument, because it reduces the work to ancillary, what's called resource labor rather than creative labor, kind of raw material, analogous to, a natural resource that's just getting maximally exploited. There was never any work, labor that wasn't dependent upon technology. The labor has always been, it has always incorporated technology in some way or another. Their actual time spent operating this technology, it does create this value that they aren't being compensated for. Um, uh, okay, so that was pretty long-winded, but I think it's. I wish I would, was better versed in economics to explain it better, but I go into it in detail because it's just such a huge reality of the world we live in, and especially that you live in. So, yeah, I think it's important to understand it. So that's everybody. So turning now to get a more specific view on the disregard of women's bodies, and even dispensability of women's bodies. Consider this recent op-ed arguing entirely uncompensated, entirely unrecognized value of domestic work, household work, and taking care of relatives dwarfs the actual income of corporations. Imagine you had a bucket big enough to hold all the money made in 2018 by the 50 biggest companies in the world. The 10.9 trillion that women didn't earn would more than fill it. The monstrous economic exploitation of women that's taken for granted is paralleled. The monstrous level of underreporting and under-prosecution of sexual violence. First of all, people might quibble about these statistics. I think that's beside the point. I think that the point that we're discussing is massive systemic distortion of what counts as normal and objective in society. So how massive is not an insignificant question, but what I think is beyond dispute is that there is a gross distortion in the normal perception of what counts as objective justice and inequality, which in particular treats black bodies, women's bodies, black labor, women's labor, and time, think also about the incarceration rates, and that's our concern in this course. Is how do we talk about reality? How do we write nonfiction prose in this context where real bodies are really suffering? So I want to just say parenthetically, although I won't be delving into the topic too much, that it's important to point out that these are two different perspectives on ideological violence in terms of race on the one hand and gender on the other. But they're not by no means mutually exclusive. On the contrary, of intersectionality and how the overlapping of these categories brings new levels and specific forms of vulnerability and violence that warrant specific attention in their own right. So the silencing that Solnit is talking about is it goes very deep. It's not just about not hearing the experience of victims of economic and sexual exploitation. It's about the victims themselves not even being able to recognize it. Solnit talks about women who, I didn't even know this wasn't normal, even anything wrong, or I had any right to expect anything different. So silencing not just by the outside world, to the outside world, but to oneself. I will relate a personal story, or it's something that relates to me, but it's not. I don't think actually that personal. The point that Solnit is making is that this is, and Coates as well, is that the violence that they're talking about is systemic. It's part of normalcy. It's not about unique cases. It's about something that's built into our normal world. My mother, she, I was raised by a single mom, and she was, she was assaulted at gunpoint at one point. We had to move because she was being stalked, and so she was very familiar with I don't know, sexually predatory behavior during her adult life. But she, a couple of years ago, her dad died relatively recently, and she'd been reminiscing with her sister about growing up together, and they were talking about going to parties and when they in high school, and just sort of recounting old memories. My mom said she was like, all of a sudden she was like, Jesus, I didn't realize I was raped. Like, I forgot about it, or I didn't even realize it at the time. I didn't register like there, or maybe that word wasn't available to me then, that it's since become available. And that was during the 60s, like the women's movement, the sense of the political new sense of political empowerment and women's rights was a lot more conscious than it was for, say, my mom's mom, not to mention all the generations before that. This is what Solent means by obliteration. This disregard or dispensability that's bearing witness to this vanishing violation of women's personhood or mattering, that she puts in this paradoxical way. Obliteration keeps showing up. It's like vanishing keeps appearing. And that's, I think it's she's talking about feeling like a ghost in one's own reality, in the same way that I think Coates' title "Between the World and Me" evokes. Paradoxical because it's sort of akin to saying vanishing, obliteration, elimination, erasure. It keeps appearing. Like, how does absence become present? I'd like you to think about that paradox. But again, it's using a poetic figure paradox to try to do justice to a reality that can't be addressed directly without implicating oneself in the very silencing that she's trying to talk about. Another, I think, tonal feature, formal feature of Solnit's nonfiction prose. How would you describe her tone, especially in the title essay, Men Explain Things to Me? It's what strikes me is the emphasis on laughter and the ridiculousness. She says after this episode of being silenced by this man, once she and her girlfriend were out of earshot, they started laughing and have never stopped. That also characterizes her the next episode she describes with the translator. She's sort of in a self-effacing way. She says, "Feel the shame, dude. Like, if you're reading this, feel the shame." Like, she's self-deprecating, it seems to me, about her own experience of being silenced. Even while she's putting it on this continuum, this slippery slope, on a continuum with very harrowing, I mean, horrifying accounts of violence that are extremely difficult to read. So that's a tonal like question that I'd like you to consider. This juxtaposition of laughter with horror. How are we supposed to, if it is a slippery slope, if silencing, if, as she says, credibility is a survival tool, being silenced in any way is subjects you to violence. So violence is always at stake. What does it mean? Where is the place for laughter in such a context? That's a question raised by her prose style. One beginning of a explanation or account of Solnit's style, I think, has to do with her resistance of dogmatism and openness to mystery. What Alison Gopnik talked about in terms of exploration, curiosity, which Solnit thematizes in the essay on Woolf, Virginia Woolf, and keeping the future obscure and uncertain. So here we see, in this passage, we see her rejection of certainty. Despair is a form of certainty. That's a powerful line. Despair is a form of certainty. There's a kind of assurance or dogmatism in being definitively despairing. Optimism is similarly confident about what will happen. Both are grounds for not acting. So that's key, I think, in illuminating as well. She's putting the priority on acting, on doing, over knowing. What's sacred is the perpetuating the conversation, perpetuating one's agency in the world, rather than simply knowing it, regardless how uh, bleak what you seem to know is. Hope can be the knowledge that reality doesn't necessarily match our plans. She describes the intellect as a kind of vengeance upon the world, preferring to understand the world rather than engage it as a participant. I prefer to just understand it as an observer. So here we see her in various ways prioritizing the practical engagement of life over the mere understanding of it. And I just think that's important to bear in mind, because so much of the power of her text comes from her documentation of facts, historical facts, and statistics. Um, I, Wordsworth put this very well. We murder to dissect. To understand things, we have to objectively, we have to kind of kill them in order to fix our understanding of things and knowledge. We have to freeze the world in a kind of as an object of clinical scrutiny. Or the deadening effect of objective understanding, Solnit describes in really vivid, evocative metaphors. In order to objectify, to reduce things to facts and linear causal explanations. A forest must be narrowed down to a tree, a web down to a line. It's maybe the key image, I think, in this text. A web must be narrowed down to a line to construct a linear narrative of blood, that's ancestry, cultural influence, or meaning. So what she's using metaphors here, and moreover, she's using them to prioritize form over content, meaning. She's saying what matters more is the web of interrelations, the web of conversations of multiple perspectives over a single determinate meaning or narrative, linear narrative. What matters more is the interplay of many different perspectives, a web, a forest. So she's using metaphors here, but these are metaphors for the importance of form, such as metaphors, over content, the meaning of a story, the lesson of a story. So what does it mean to avoid the reduction of the forest to the tree or the web to the line? Reduction of the complex web of reality into the simple meanings of facts and linear narratives. I think labor is a good term for it. Work. And it's elaborated in different ways. I'm going to just discuss a little bit Rousseau's idea of the social contract, and Hegel, the German philosopher Hegel's idea of the master-slave dialectic. Rousseau suggests that civilization began with this proprietary claim, the claim to own. He makes a further point that Hegel will build on, that in nature There's no place for domination in nature. It doesn't make any economic sense. There's no reason to pretend to own anything. Um, you can prevail over another organism, but you have no reason to claim to own it. You subdue it, however, is necessary in those circumstances, even kill it or destroy it, but then you move on. There's no reason to own. It doesn't make any economic sense. It's not worth your time to own anything in nature. Um, that only becomes uh, economically profitable and viable in the context of law, of holding things fixed and steady in that manner of the left brain. So Hegel developed this master-slave dialectic to explain the dynamic of domination in human society. Just, imagine as a kind of thought experiment. There's at some point there became two individuals, each equally invested in being the owner, being in control of a piece of land or a wife or whatever. They're both. It was mutually exclusive. It was like one or the other could inhabit this position of being the master, the owner. This resulted in what a subsequent follower of Hegel's called the fight to the death for pure prestige. This social prestige of being seen as the one who owns, the one who is in control. That's what's different from nature. In nature, it's just you win or you don't win. You win, and you prevail or you don't. Then you move on. But what's at stake in civilization, in culture, is the prestige of the claim to control. So, and Hegel's point about this duel is it's totally accidental who wins. Again, it's not a natural achievement. It can't be retraced to any natural attribute like superior strength. Because what's stake again is the social prestige of this new cultural ideal of ownership. So Hegel imagines, these two fighting to the death, and sooner or later one blinks or one submits and says, "I'd rather survive than die for the sake of this prestige." Hegel's story is that an ironic reversal happens at that point. While it seems like the master has prevailed and got what he wanted, if you think about how that actually plays out, the consequences again are ironic. Because for the master, in order to believe to have his status as master sustained, he actually is dependent on the slave. The master needs the slave in order to reflect his own mastery back to him. Because again, it's an arbitrary social fantasy, being a master. There's no natural qualification for it. It's a social fantasy. Maintaining belief in that requires the slave somehow perpetually demonstrate it. So there's a deep psychological insight at play here, which is gruesomely demonstrated throughout history, that masters. Unlimited coercive power makes people sadistic. And the most vivid demonstration of this is the Stanford prison experiment, where undergraduates at Stanford in the 60s were arbitrarily divided into guards and prisoners, and the guards were given sort of absolute control over them. And within a day or two, they became so outrageously, sadistically mistreating the prisoners that they had to call off the experiment early. But you see it all the time, police, or whenever anyone has unchecked coercive power over other people, there's a strong inclination to abuse it, not because it's fun, but because you don't really understand why you have it, and it's sort of aggravating. And in a way, so you take out your aggravation. So that's a long-winded way of showing how the master becomes the slave of the slave. It's because the master makes a mistake. The slave does not submit to the master. He submits to his fear of death. He doesn't. It's not. I'm not. It's not that I'm so scared of you. I'm not so awestruck by you that I'm speaking now as the slave that submits to the master. It's that I'm awestruck by death. I don't want to die, and you're going to kill me. So I'm submitting to my fear of death. And the master mistakes that as a fear of me, as if I'm the Lord. But in Hegel's terms, there is only one master, absolute master, and that's death. We are all mortal. We all submit to the authority of death, and the inscrutability of it, the understandability of it. That's the only true master. And so that's what the slave submits to. The slave has ability to work in the world in a way that, to be sure, is to a greater or lesser degree prescribed by the master, but not exhaustively prescribed. There's a kind of marginal freedom to undertake his work on his own terms. Part of this dynamic is that the master is lost in his head, filled with contempt for the body and the earth, which are infinitely unsatisfying, infinitely unable to satisfactorily substantiate his self-image as the master. Whereas the slave is curious and open to possibilities offered by the earth and the body, the expressive possibilities opened by the earth and the body. So that there's relative freedom of expression and of communication. The work of the slave becomes the source of culture. And this, again, is very, I think, vividly demonstrated by history. Culture always arises from the grassroots in society, fashion, music, always is generated by circumstantial creativity that isn't normatively prescribed, but that is discovered through interaction with material circumstances. And I've really been focusing on the sort of paradoxes of the master, but the real point of this master-slave dialectic is the liberation of the slave, the way in which the slave demonstrates what freedom means. Hegel characterizes his work, I suggest, in terms of labor and as a way of like correlating the female body, the pains of childbirth, the labor, the work of the female body. So if the master's sort of lost in his head and violently acting out against the world for its failure to substantiate his sense of himself as master, by contrast, the slave exists only in time, only in embodied time. That's the only reality the slave knows. The slave chose life over death. I want to survive. Um, Again, going back to that video about learning to ride a bike, it's out of a sense of survival. I'm persisting and aware and, in Gopnik's terms, curious and experimental and open to explore the opportunities that the world's, our actual time, our actual environment, our actual body makes available. This is and also aware of mortality. It's choosing life, choosing existence and an awareness of mortality. This also amounts to an invention of what work is. Work is what work does. It creates a social conversation among workers of mutual recognition, of a mutual recognition of how we inhabit our bodies and perform our work. That's what culture is. I want to try to begin to draw this back to Solnit by talking about rights and the way in which she emphasizes a kind of unacknowledged history that goes from abolition of slavery through the acquisition of suffrage for women and reproductive rights to just recently rights for sexual minorities, queer rights. These progressive social movements on a deeper level are about concern for embodiment, concern for the predicament of bodies. The figure of the web, that's what I think she's getting at here. It's that history is a web of interplay. This video is about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I like it because it's set to music. So while you watch this, while you read the Declaration of Human Rights, ask yourself what the music is doing. Is it just background? How does the experience of the music exemplify, evoke, teach you something about what rights mean, about the application of rights, this translation of rights among different bodies? Solnit's book, she discusses this gorgeous painting. It's a very paradoxical painting. And its gorgeousness is paradoxical. It's about covering and the violence that sort of suffocation entails. This is an image of the obliteration, the silencing, but it's also an occasion of a kind of formal creativity that maybe transcends the limited terms of concepts in the same way music does. I think so, and I think the video also suggests how rights work is what work does. Likewise with rights, what a right means, the right to free speech, to assembly, to privacy. We discover that through work. There's nothing absolute about these concepts. We discover what they mean by applying them to actual situations, and that's why that's the logic of this web of transference among of rights among different groups. Anyway, so I just like how this video takes these terms, the abstract terms of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and turns it into a kind of dance, a dance of application to the world. That's what I think the work of the slave is about, and it's as exemplified in blues music, the tremendous legacy of blues music for all culture. And like this image, it's about pain, as Solnit says about it. The woman who is represented is obscured, but the woman who represents is not. The act, the agency of representation, the agency of speaking, somebody's speaking through this image of an obscured or silenced figure, has the same kind of paradoxical structure as blues music. Speaking about pain becomes a means of self-expression.